and please bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
David Yarrow, who is a very inspiring character to me, is a man who has carved himself out as one of the most sought-after fine art photographers in the world. He made this career for himself in the field after his kids became adults and his marriage failed. He acknowledges that he would not have been able to achieve the success he had were it not for the freedom that a separation from familial obligations gave him. The freedom to simply pursue whatever was on his agenda. This is to put it very bluntly and in much less elegant words than he says himself, and there's also a chance of misrepresenting what he said, but just for the sake of the question, assume that's the message. You flirt with this idea quite a bit throughout the book and even use the potentially hurtful words of family obligations. A word I've used in the presence of my girlfriend before, not to good effect. Clearly, family is, for some, an inescapable component of becoming who you are, but it is also a giant sacrifice as well in your potential to become who you are. So as someone whose father was absent, because he was trying to fill as much experience into his life as possible at the cost of his family, someone who I am speculating might have had resented family obligations. You are now a father yourself, in addition to Becca, I believe your daughter's name is, 2 new children. How conscious are you of the trade-off that family life presents? And it's very unemotional language, but how do you stop resentment at the gate? And how do you think about one of life's most important trade-offs, an individual becoming who they are and the sacrifice of that pursuit in supporting a family, your responsibility that you have willingly created?
It's a great question. It's a very good question. And I'm going to answer it in the context of hiking with Nietzsche, and then I'm going to answer it in the context of the present.
Okay.
So when I went to Sils Maria for the second time when I was 36, I took my wife at the time and my daughter, or our daughter. And when I went back to the mountains, I was kind of expecting that I would, as I was when I was 19, be able to hike any mountain I wanted, whenever I wanted, and that I could get lost if I wanted, and I could disappear if I wanted. Which it turns out that was not actually feasible when you have, as you say, family obligations. In the story, it becomes clear that there's a tension between individual actualization and raising kids and being a good partner, right? It's tough to do that unless you align becoming, yourself with being part of a family or being a father. And that alignment is incredibly difficult to manage. And one of the thoughts that came out of hiking with Nietzsche is lots of parents and lots of partners try to pretend that there's no tension, that everything is going hunky-dory, that everything is perfect. And in part, hiking with Nietzsche was to show, like, hey, there are tensions. There are tensions that we don't like to talk about. Like, these are the forbidden questions of being in a family or being in a partnership. Now, hiking with Nietzsche, as it turns out, probably is a perfect case study of 2 individuals trying to find their own, become who they are, and then that family fracturing. Like, you don't see that in the book, but that's how the story of hiking with Nietzsche ended, right? And it didn't turn out. I mean, there's the sense that that I say quite clearly, even if you have insights like I should forgive myself for these feelings, I should make these feelings public, I should talk about these tensions, like that's what I say at the end of the book. And I also say, you should forgive yourself for this, and I should forgive myself for these feelings. You don't end up, as I say, a Buddhist monk with perfect relationships or being a perfect parent. It doesn't happen. No. And in fact, it didn't happen in a huge way, right? I mean, I was so interested in my own self-actualization. I didn't realize that my partner of the time was actualizing herself in all sorts of ways outside of the marriage. And I didn't realize that. But that's what was happening. And then 2 years later, the family just went poof. Now since then, I've come to a better realization about the tensions between self-actualization and being a family member or being a father. At least in part because I was on the receiving end of feeling like, I was in the position of saying, hey, you're actualizing yourself and you're forgetting about all your family obligations to my partner in Hiking with Nietzsche. I eventually came to say that to her, right? Like, hey, you're the one who's leaving. Like, what's up? And now that now that I've gone through that process, I now am in a position where I can say, hey, I am now in another marriage. I've been, I'm married to a woman named Kathleen, and we have 2 kids. And there's a sense of getting older and realizing, like this tension that I'm feeling, right, about becoming myself, what I have to remember is that everyone around me who's an adult is also trying to do this, right? And it's not just me. Like, I'm not the center of, like I'm not the ruler of my cranial-sized universe. Like, everyone else is trying to do this. And I think that realization makes it a little bit easier to understand the process of becoming as being cooperative. And I mean, you don't get to go to the mountains by yourself or become a famous photographer, or unless you have certain types of support. Like, even if that support is domestic help, for example, like you have certain dependencies, certain enablements. And that is a realization that I think many young men who are obsessed with Nietzsche at the beginning eventually need to come to, or at least I do. It's like, I have all of these enablements, all of these dependencies that I have on others. And I'm not I'm not carrying on all by myself. Now, that's not as sexy or as romantic as, the sole individual struggling against his family life. But it's probably a more well-adjusted, and at least in my case, a more honest approach. And I think that my father, you mentioned my dad, my father was this great experiencer. Like, he wanted the deepest and most crazy experiences. Yeah. He wasn't a great father. He wasn't a great partner, drank too much. And he never would say that he was dependent on others until the very end, when he died at 56 of esophageal cancer. Then he realized it, that he was dependent on others. But I think that dependency is an underrated or an oftentimes neglected fact of life. That's where my head has gone since Hiking with Nietzsche. I bet you didn't expect me to say that.
No, to be honest, I actually did. I mean, in my eyes, there's 2 ways to deal with it. Well, not 2 ways. Nothing's binary. Well, some things are binary. This isn't binary, but there are 2 big ways you could deal with it. 2 pools. One, which from the description of your dad throughout the book, seems like the perpetual yes to the call to adventure, and the dismissal of your responsibilities. And perhaps you could speculate that maybe your father never became who he was because he didn't give full credence to his responsibilities, which is his family, which, like it or not, it's a responsibility, right? You've decided to do this, especially when a child comes into the picture. And a part of becoming who you are is to fully take ownership of your responsibilities, right? And your family is probably the biggest responsibility. And so maybe you could almost say that even though you can't say yes to every call to adventure that falls on your plate, because it would be ideal to just say, I'm going to check out for a couple of years and do exactly what I know in my heart I need to be doing. In fact, it is more becoming who you are to say no to the call to adventure and do the harder thing and to like fulfill your responsibilities to the people around you.
Can I say something?
Of course. Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a way where you enter into relationships, into family life, into obligations of family life. And if you simply say, I can do nothing else, I must do this. Like I am compelled because of some sort of 10 Commandments style dictate. That is wrong, right? That's not Nietzschean. That's called bad faith, like what existentialists call bad faith, which is to say that you could not do otherwise. What is, however, Nietzschean is to say, for a person like me, what is most difficult is for me to take help, for me to, care for myself, for me to realize that I'm part of something, what is most absolutely hard is for me not to go find the nearest mountain, for me not to push myself to certain limits. So, and I'm choosing to invest in a family, and which is incredibly hard, right, for an individual like me, right? And it has now become easier as I've begun to realize that part of a relationship and love is to actually allow one to be cared for, and which I never really did before.
Okay.
Right. And that's very hard. I mean, that's really hard and I'm not alone in this. I mean, I've talked to enough readers of Hiking with Nietzsche where they say, God, like my relationships are so hard. Like I just want to be by myself. Right. And I say to them, yes, but if you're just by yourself all the time, remember that Zarathustra, Nietzsche's most famous character, goes between solitude and community. He shuttles back and forth, right? And I think in part that's what Nietzsche is indicating is like find solitude in the community, find some clear headspace in the community so that you can give back. And then, I mean, honestly, sometimes you do need to take a little bit of geographic space. But I think I've taken enough geographic space in my life that I need to stay in the community a little bit more.
And it's also easy to blame those closest to you for being the ones that stand between you and becoming who you are. That's, I'm sure, a phenomenon you've experienced personally, but also with the readers of Hiking with Nietzsche as well. You get told this idea from a philosopher that you start to romanticize that you could in fact be everything that you could be. And you start taking measures of your life. Well, what is, stopping me from this? Oh, maybe it's my partner, maybe it's my family, maybe it's my friends, maybe it's my job. And I guess unless you go through the difficulty of realizing that it wasn't in fact these things that stood in your way, it is most of the time yourself. Because you realize once the barriers are removed, everything's exactly the same. It's actually you that needs to be fixed to actually become who you are.
Yeah. I mean, there's this part out of Nietzsche, Hiking with Nietzsche, where I say, we are always in the process of trying, or many of us are in the process of trying to trade up, right? Get the better car, get the better house, get the better partner, and then when we discover that we're disappointed, like it comes as a shock to us that these things don't live up to our expectations, when actually more often than not, the problem's not with the things of the world, but with myself, right? Oh, it's me who's the problem. And that's the part that Hermann Hesse has out of Steppenwolf at the end of Hiking with Nietzsche, where he says, every time you're sad or every time you're angry or pissed off or bored, ask yourself, is this not me? Perhaps the issue is not with the world, but with me. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing to think about. I also think that, if you think about the thought experiment that Nietzsche gives us called the eternal recurrence, he says in the eternal recurrence, he says, imagine that a demon comes to you in your loneliest of lonelies and says these words to you, that you must live this moment, this very moment, over again, not once, twice, or 100 times, but an infinite number of times. And would that thought crush you or elevate your soul? Now, Nietzsche thinks that you can answer the eternal recurrence with the will to power, which is this idea that like the most meaningful parts of life are the ones that you really work at and that you succeed and you triumph. But as you grow older, you realize that like the vast majority of life is not triumph. It's betrayal and boredom and being pissed off and being sad. And where your will is not exercised in these triumphant ways, right? Where your will fails you. So how do you affirm the eternal return then? Well, Nietzsche says that you have to employ what he calls the love of fate. And you have to say that I'm choosing, not only accepting, but actually choosing moments that I experience myself as my sickest, my most embarrassed, humiliated, whatever. And you have to come to love those moments as well. And that's brutally difficult, I would say, for most people. Like when I tell my students that, they're like, how the hell would you ever do that? You have to affirm the fact that your dad beat you up? Like, that sounds pretty horrible, right? But if you don't do that, think about what it would be to be strong enough to see those moments of great sickness or embarrassment or pain as something that made you who you are, and to wrap those moments into who you are and affirm your life on the whole. Like, that's crazy power. That's crazy strength. It's not just acceptance. It's not like, oh, I just bear it. But you say, I've used those moments to make me who I am. I think it's a hard thought for Nietzsche, or for